Genesis chapter 1, and let's jump into day 4. I want to raise a question. I think it's healthy to raise questions. I want to mention a theologian whose reputation has been just absolutely trashed in modern contemporary theological circles because there was a misunderstanding about what he was trying to do when he asked questions. That's Origen. You have many who are now, they've come forward over the past 100, 150 years and have deemed Origen as a heretic. And that's strange when you actually study and you read his writings. So he's trying to understand views that the church is still working out. For example, you get into the Council of Nicaea, and they're clearly defining the Trinity and the relationship between the persons in the Godhead. And they deemed his view heretical. Yet, you need to understand what he was trying to do. He never moved away from established doctrine. But because he had been trained in philosophy and believed that the great philosophical truths, as he understood them, could be reconciled with divine revelation. In fact, when you think about this, the word logos, for example, in John 1, the word is the Greek word logos. That was a philosophical concept. And John's taking that and showing that the true logos is Jesus Christ. So it doesn't seem strange to me that one who was trained in philosophy like Origen and trained in theology would seek to reconcile the two to some extent. Now, maybe at times he did go too far, but here's what he does. He raises questions. So he's doing, if you will, theological exploration. Now, when I became a Christian, and this is relevant for Genesis, so I'm going to tell you why. This is relevant for our study of Genesis. When I became a Christian, I was saved in a church that I believe was preaching the gospel. However, you weren't allowed to ask theological questions that were outside of the settled questions. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about or not. There were questions you could ask, and then there were questions you couldn't ask. It seems strange, though. I mean, you would think for any question we would be able to provide an answer. But there were just some things you weren't even allowed to ask. And you come to Genesis, and it's one of those places where people can get pretty sensitive real fast if you simply ask a question. Now, I'm not going full gap theory on you here tonight. I don't think so. That's never going to happen, not with me. You may get one of these other guys up here, and they go full Schofield on you, but I'm not going to. And so that's not where I'm at. But I'm asking some questions because when we come to the text, I've already told you, it's a given the text presents lunar days. The Bible doesn't tell us an age. I certainly don't think that we could make an argument for millions and billions of years. I don't know. I would say relatively young, but what is that? Is that 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 years? I don't know. I know that population growth, if you go too far back, basically you'd have population that's just running it, barely moving up, and all of a sudden it completely spikes. So if humanity's here for really kind of more than 100,000 years, the population now, it would just dwarf, our population would be dwarfed by what it would be. So I think that there's some lines of argument that could be made, but when we come to the text, I think that there's a lot that we've failed to appreciate or even understand because we're scared to even ask questions. So when we come to the text, I've already pointed out it's from a geocentric perspective. And young people, here's what that means. It means that when you're standing on the earth, this is the perspective. So let's talk about a geocentric perspective, and then I want to talk about a few questions that I would like to raise as we get into day 4. So when you think about our galaxy, it's called the Milky Way, okay? Now think about this. What's the shape of the Milky Way? Now there's speculations. NASA has some mock-ups of what they think that it looks like. But think about this. It's rhetorical. Why is it that we don't and we can't really get an accurate or true picture of its shape? It's because we're seeing it from inside. We live inside of the galaxy known as the Milky Way. So our perspective is always from within it. Therefore, our view of it is limited. We can't get outside of the Milky Way and develop a picture of it. So we have some limitations there. We recognize that. So what we have in Genesis is God's providing us an explanation, a description of His creation, but doing so that a person standing on planet Earth can understand what He has done. Now that's important. I think it's very important, especially when we get to day 4, and we're trying to understand each day sequentially and what God is doing and why it matters. So my question, one that frankly would not have been allowed to be asked in the church where I became a Christian, is God using a structure in creation so that human life would be ordered, and in the ordering of human life, He gives us this understanding and perspective of Him as a God of order who creates functions for a distinct purpose. When you think about it, life is ordered around 7 days. And our life is structured based on this creation account. It certainly doesn't seem like a stretch that God would describe things so that we could understand them. But then I must push back, because Genesis wasn't written to us. Now, it was written for us because all of Scripture is for us, because the Holy Spirit inspired it. So in understanding who it was written to, the most likely audience is Israel in the wilderness. We have to try to understand what had they just experienced, and what are they going to experience, and what are theological points that must be made. Well, what did they just experience? They had just lived in a land for many generations, 400 some years, where there were many gods worshipped. Now, if you take the 10 plagues, you will see in each one of those plagues is a denunciation of a so-called God. It's the defeat of a so-called God. So even in this revelation, as God is revealing Himself, He's simultaneously revealing Himself and demonstrating in His revelation that He has no rivals or competitors. There are none. It is just Him. In fact, how many times do you read in the plagues that they would know that I am the Lord? Over and over you hear this. So when we come to this account, we need to be reminded that they had come out of a country where many gods were worshipped, and they were entering a land where many gods were worshipped. Could God have not simply just said, your life should be ordered around a 7-day calendar because I created everything? Of course He could have. But why does He do it this way? This text is interesting because I'm going to point this out. The words for the sun and moon in Hebrew aren't used. They're not used here. Those words existed, but He says the greater and lesser lights. Why? I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you came here tonight wanting to know why those Hebrew words weren't used and why I used greater and lesser lights. Because this is a theological statement. This isn't a statement of exclusivity, like each and every other day is a declaration of the exclusivity of the one true living God, that He has no rivals and that He is worthy of worship. We get to the 7th day and say, well, you better keep the 7th because it's for worship. But I can tell you this, when I look at each and every day of the creation week, it's a reminder that whether I'm looking at my watch and I'm realizing that I live in time, I serve a God who created time. With the air I'm breathing, the God created this atmosphere, the land I'm standing on, the fact I'm not covered in water. I look around, there's life moving. I have life in me. I'm an image bearer. Everything that I'm looking around and seeing is meant to call me to worship. Genesis chapter 1 is a clear call to worship. That's why we begin our worship services that way. Listen, God created us and called us to worship Him. Our proper response is exaltation. That's why we have a call to worship followed by what? A prayer of exaltation. You say, I just thought that's just the way you wanted it, preacher. I just thought you had issues with rock bands and smokes and lights and stuff like that. This isn't about preference. This isn't about my preference or your preference. This is about our liturgy following the liturgy of the Bible. We see here in day 4 the creation of stars, the sun, the moon. Let's pick up together in verse 14. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be there for signs and for seasons." I just want you to hit pause for just a second. I want you to note something. For signs and for seasons. So they're distinct. It's not for signs and seasons. Notice that. I think this is an important point in translation. And for days and years. Notice the difference there, though. There isn't a second for. I think that's going to be important in our interpretation. And let them be lights in the let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. It was so. God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw it was good. There was evening and there was morning the 4th day. We look at this, there's so much we could talk about, but let us just kind of stand in awe for just a moment of God's creation. We think about the Milky Way, it's a galaxy. What is a galaxy? I don't know, but I could recommend some viewing for you. If you're interested in a further discussion on it, I would recommend Star Trek. There's a lot out there. I think it's a documentary. It's interesting. They found aliens. But anyway, I'd recommend that to you. A large group of stars, gas, and dust bound together by gravity. That's NASA's definition. That tells me they really don't know what a galaxy is, but we know some things about it. It's just a large group of stars, gas, dust, and bound by gravity. Our sun is one star in the Milky Way. NASA estimates 100 billion stars in our galaxy alone, with the length of the Milky Way being 100,000 light years long. That's amazing when you think about it. Our solar system is approximately 25,000 light years from the center of our galaxy. I can't even get my head around that. Just like the earth travels around the sun travels around the center of the galaxy. So it's not just stationary, it's actually moving too. Now, I already told you I don't believe creation is millions and millions of years old, but mathematically they estimate if the sun was to make a full rotation around the center of the galaxy, it would take 250 million years. That's a long time. We've barely started our first lap. So how many galaxies are there, though? Because that's 100 billion stars in this one galaxy. How many? Well, they had an estimate, and then in the 90s, the Hubble Deep Field Scope caused NASA to estimate that there may be 200 billion galaxies. So I wanted to do the math. It's 1 septillion stars. Teenagers, you would write it like this. Write the number 1, then write 24 zeros. That's how many stars. Look at Psalm chapter 104. Let's just look there for a moment. I think it's important for us to understand how God's people have responded to his creation. Psalm 104. Let's just pick up in verse 1. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. Remember, that would come from the language we've already talked about the expanse. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. Now, I'm going to be careful. You got to be careful with the poetic descriptions. And by the way, it won't be long. You'll be on YouTube and you'll say that the earth is flat because you read half of this verse. So those of you who believe that, I'm sorry. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flame of fire. Of course, we know this is quoted in Hebrews as a reference to Jesus as creator. He set the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sunk down to take place at your appointed for them. You set a boundary they may not pass, so that they may not ever again cover the earth. And he goes on and he continues to talk about these things that God, it's a song of praise. I think it's important when you recognize that this is strategically placed in what is known as the fifth book in the 5 books of the Psalms. It's essentially, we're looking for this rightful king. We found him. Hebrews points that out as it references that text, not only that one, but Psalm 110 and others as praising the Lord. So, when we think about day 4, what should our appropriate response be? Our response should be worship. These celestial bodies, that is stars, other planets, moons, whatever, their purpose is for signs and for seasons, days, and years. It's to mark these. The New American Standard Bible says, serve as a sign for seasons, but I don't think that's the best translation. I think the ESV gets it right, where it says, be for signs and for seasons. Why is that? Because signs function theologically in the Old Testament. They act as functionaries and indicators through which God conveys knowledge and reveals himself. I'll give you just one example. We can think about a very famous example. We can think about at Christmas, where the Magi say they saw his star from the east. I don't think that they meant they saw it in the east because they were moving west, but there are men from the east who saw his star. So they recognize. There's a number of other times we could point to that as a sign. Sometimes it's used metaphorically. But signs were understood to have theological meaning, and that God used those signs to communicate. Now, not in the way we would think today as if you read your horoscope. Why is this important? Because it demonstrates that all revelation, that is true, genuine revelation, comes from God. What about seasons? It's used throughout the first 5 books of the Bible for religious festivals, feast days of the liturgical calendar. Now, you might think that this word carries with it the idea of like 4 seasons like you would have if you were in like the Midwest or up north further. Here, you don't have 4 seasons, so you may have never considered this. You have 1 season and 3 weeks of reprieve from it, and that's it. So we may be tempted. When we moved here, my wife has said to me she misses the seasons. I think what she misses the beauty of the spring and fall change, because it is a beautiful thing to see, to behold. But I don't believe that's the way the word is being used here. The way the word is being used and the way it's used throughout the first 5 books of the Bible is to denote religious festivals and feast days of the worship calendar. So it has a religious function. But for us, we look at the calendar, we look at things, and we might think, well, this doesn't have a religious function. But when we look at the creation account, does it not teach us that every single thing in our life is connected to religion? Does Genesis, let me ask you, it's a fair question. Does Genesis chapters 1 and 2 allow for a secular, sacred divide. Does it allow for you to divide your work from religion? You might say, I don't work at a Christian work environment. Are you there? If you're there, it's a Christian workplace because you're there. You say, well, I look at the calendar and it's got this holiday on there and this month and that month. Listen, just because somebody wrote something in or forced it in on your Google Calendar doesn't mean it's legit. Okay, look, the calendar, every single day of that calendar should be devoted that when I wake up in the morning that God's mercies have renewed, not in the sense that they faded off in the middle of the night, but they're renewed in my mind because I'm reminded I woke back up, I've got life, so therefore I'm going to worship God. You say, well, I can't wait for the weekend. Why would you blow today? Why would you waste a Wednesday when you could have worshiped God all day? You could have praised Him. You could have acknowledged when you walked around and saw life around you and experienced His breathing in His air and experiencing life in His goodness. Why wouldn't that compel you and call you to worship? See, the problem is that we've bought into this idea that we've lost, that it's over. We've given up schools. We've given up, listen, not only have we given up government, folks, we've given up the calendar. We've given up workplace. We've given up publishing. We've given up every single thing and pretending that the only thing religious about our life is when we gather on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Every single thing about your life should be focused and dedicated on the religious. I promise you this, every single person is religious. Every single person and every aspect of their life is religiously oriented. The only question I have for you is who's the God of their religion? For seasons. We would do well to get back to thinking about a liturgical calendar. When was the last time that we celebrated as a church the day of Pentecost? Last May. We did. Apparently there's a price to pay for celebrating the day of Pentecost, but anyway, we'll see how it goes this May. We'll see. Have we celebrated the ascension of Christ? We celebrated that day on the calendar? See, I think we need to think through these things in a theological manner. For days and years, one function, not two. I've already demonstrated that in the text. It means for one function. That is, the position of the sun, moon, and stars were the foundational indicators for determining ancient calendars. So this idea in the text is that God superintends, He created time, and He superintends the calendar. There isn't a day that He's not sovereign over. There isn't a movement of the stars that He's not ordered and governs. We must wake up to this reality. Every single day we must go to bed with this reality. The moon established the months when they began and ended. The stars helped us calculate the solar year. But in the ancient world, the world they were encountering, the Sumerian gods, On, Enlil, and Enki, were considered to have been in charge of the moon and stars and put them in place. So you had to worship each one of them or different times. Confusion over who had authority and jurisdiction. Whose venue is this? We don't know. The Babylonian god, Shamash, or the sun god, was said to have regulated the seasons. But we come to this text, and this is a declaration that every one of your gods are false gods. There's one true and living God. Lights, just a generic word, I've already mentioned. It doesn't use the Hebrew words for sun and moon, but why? Some have suggested the Hebrew words were very similar to words, by the way, Hebrew and languages around them are similar. But that those Hebrew words were close to the words used of false gods who were associated with the sun and moon. That meticulous detail, to that sort of detail in this text tells me this is someone who is philosophically trained, theologically trained, and someone who understands the worldviews around him. I put forward Moses as the ideal candidate. No other gods were ever brought into existence. See, I want you to understand the picture. I'm going to give you a working man's picture of the ancient Near East polytheistic structure versus truth. See, in the ancient Near East, your God may not have been strong enough to handle the whole thing. So he needs help. I mean, look, bringing the sun up, that takes some work, right? I mean, the sun does rise, doesn't it? It rises we say things like that. The sun actually doesn't rise, but we say things like that. So, that takes work. That takes effort. Well, one God couldn't do all this. The sun, different stars, the moon, the water, the land, animals, weather. It's just too complex for one God. So he's got to have a crew. He delegates it to him. And so there may be one high God or maybe several. It just depends on the worldview. But they've got to share the work. Because that's a lot of work. I'm going to be honest with you. It is a full-time, actually it's not just one full-time job. I got to tell you this. I used to think it was a full-time job to take care of me. It actually is like 2 full-time jobs. It takes me and my wife to take care of me. Okay, so it is 2 full-time jobs. I can barely keep it together. I forget things all the time. And I guess it's only going to get worse. But anyway, I do. I lose things. I lose my check card on the regular. I forget things. And you say, well, what's wrong with you? Well, I don't know. But my wife helps me. She makes sure that I get the right things in the right place at the right time. And I always have backups. When I leave the house, I always have, you're going to think this is crazy, but I put in my gym bag, I got a backup pair of underwear, a backup shirt, a backup deodorant. I got a backup deodorant in my car. I got a backup deodorant in my desk at work. You say, why? Because I forgot to put deodorant on before, okay? So look, you won't catch me slipping. Anyway, so I've got it everywhere. Got mouthwash wherever I go, just in case. See, I need help. It's a lot to get this guy from point A to point B. How much greater is the challenge to orchestrate, organize, superintend all that we see? The declaration is there was no delegation in the creation or in the sovereign ordering or in the upholding of all that you see, although it's greater than you can imagine. There was absolutely no delegation in it. God is the only one who created, superintends, upholds, and is propelling it to its ultimate end. That's a beautiful statement when you think about it. Well, let me say something else that we've missed. And I fear that we've missed it because we've dove into Ezekiel trying to find the magic temple that's supposedly going to be rebuilt and whatever other stories we're hearing. But instead of going back and recognizing that God constructed a cosmic temple, it's called the universe. Everything that comes after it is designed to call us back to it. The word lights is interesting because when you see this word in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, which I believe were authored by Moses, the language is used, the wording throughout. The author is the same author throughout. 10 occurrences of this word outside of Genesis 1 in the Pentateuch all refer to the light of the lampstand that lights up the tabernacle. That's interesting. In fact, when we see all of the structure of the tabernacle and later the temple, we're recognizing all this Edenic and creation imagery and language. Why is that? Because they understood that the universe was a cosmic temple. See, in the ancient Near East, you worshiped God, your God, where? Within his jurisdiction, all right? Within his land, and inside of his house, his temple. So he was limited. That's where you worshiped him at. I know this is plain to you, but you should be reminded of it. And where is it that we worship our God? Everywhere. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. The heavens declare the glory of God. Who else could that be said of? Genesis is clear. There's no one else that could be said of. There is no one like you, Lord. Who is like you? That they could say that the creation itself, every square inch of it, its vastness beyond our ability to understand or comprehend, but yet every single millisecond, every single microorganism, every speck of matter is meant to call us to worship. There is no one like you, Lord. So when we come to Genesis, yes, let's have the fights, let's have the arguments, let's have the debates. Let's talk about, is it 10,000 or 50,000 years old? Let's waste our time on that. Instead, let's focus on what the text is calling us to do, is to worship God. God created His own temple. I think about the beauty of this because this image runs through it. I'll wrap this up. I've got more notes. I thought I was wrapping it up. But anyway, so the idea was, maybe I'll get to those notes next week, I don't know. We see this, and then that same language, that tabernacle language, continues when we get into John's Gospel and into the Revelation. In John's Gospel, we hear in John chapter 1, verse 14, that He dwelt among us. And that word dwelt means to tabernacle, or to set up His tent. The tabernacle was a tent. Now I'm going to tell you something. This is amazing. This is amazing how smart Moses was. So the tabernacle, when you look at the kind of the initial structure of it, now the furnishings are unique in what they're communicating, but the actual kind of basic outline structure of it resembles Pharaoh's war tent. With, at the very center, was where Pharaoh sat on his throne, dwelt in his living quarters when they were on the move. The structure, the outline of it, of the tabernacle, nearly mimics that outline. Now, I mean, if you can't see this, I want to have dinner at your expense because I want to talk to you about this. I do. I want to get into this. It may take 6 or 7 dinners, but the beauty of this is that what He does is not only, of course, with the furnishings based on the Edenic, the creation account, calling us back to worship, recognizing that what was lost can be regained. God provides for us this opportunity to commune with Him. Still unbelievable that He would do that. But what He's announcing is that this superpower with the strongest, most powerful human being alive, who was supposed to be a God Himself, or the manifestation of a God, was nothing compared to the one and true living God. It's like the ultimate smackdown. It's amazing when you think about it. John chapter 1, verse 14, John says that, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Here's this idea of the tabernacle, God's presence. Of course, when the temple, the veil is torn, when Jesus dies, showing that this is not how you would get access. You would get access through the Lord Jesus Christ. But John picks up this exact same language at the end of the Bible and Revelation. It's beautiful because what was lost because of our sin is regained in the end. He says in chapter 21 of Revelation, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven, the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." By the way, I'm just going to, when you read this, you'll see that the New Jerusalem is the universe itself. God's presence is seen and known everywhere. "I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God.'" Same phrase we see in John, by the way, same author, Revelation and John. Chapter 1, verse 14, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be His people, and God Himself will be with them as their God." What do we have in Genesis? This is what we have. It's creation, and man is communing with God, and it's lost. What is lost is regained. Every verse, every chapter, every word of the Bible is a call to worship. Every single part of it. Everything we look around and see is a reminder of God's sovereign authority and power, of His majesty, of His infinite wisdom, of His unchanging character, of His unparalleled and unsurpassed power. When we look around, we can simply say, who is like you, Lord? You say, my problems feel like they're big problems. Well, sometimes they feel big because we think God is small. Those problems seem a lot smaller when we realize how big and how amazing our God is. I don't mean big in somehow scope, in size, like actual physical size, but I mean in that just how great He is. Let's end on that note tonight.